Miles Reddington stepped into the control suite a full hour before sunrise, the solace of his polished but sleep-worn loafers making a dull sound against the slate tile. He hadn't slept, not really. He had paced most of the night, mentally rehearsing the product flow, rehearsing his team's possible questions, and going over the timeline again and again like a soldier memorizing a battle map. This was the restock they had staked everything on, the one meant to redeem the awkward silence after the first wave of backlash from Meghan's lifestyle brand. As ever, now they had one shot to make it seem deliberate, intimate, effortless. He set his ceramic mug down next to the glowing monitor. It had gone cold, but he didn't notice. Felix Jiang was already at the second terminal, his usual fastidious grooming undone by the weight of stress. His shirt was wrinkled, and he had forgotten his glasses again, squinting hard at the figures as he ran diagnostics for the 7th time that morning. Neither of them spoke at first. They simply stared at the numbers on the dashboard like scientists, waiting for an eclipse. The site was scheduled to go live at exactly 8 a.m. Pacific Time. Felix confirmed the CDN cache was cleared. Miles had queued the customer support responses in case of lag. Every influencer post was scheduled to go up at 8:03. They had preloaded behind the scenes Instagram stories with soft piano audio and garden shots. Everything was supposed to feel serene, curated, meaningful. At 7:58, the trouble began. Felix noticed at first the stone milk wrap, Meghan's signature piece, was already showing as sold out. He frowned and refreshed the backend inventory. Over 1,000 units were listed as available in the primary warehouse. That didn't match the front-end behavior. Miles leaned forward, his hand twitching slightly as he reached for the second laptop. He pulled up the public product page, and his heart dropped. The item didn't say coming soon. It didn't say available at 8. It said out of stock. By 8:01, 3 other hero products were showing the same status. The sage cream cardigan, the blush robe, and the linen lounge pants, all marked unavailable. All with stock untouched. Miles felt a cold sweat bead down the back of his neck. Felix tried contacting their Shopify engineer. No response. Then he called the fulfillment liaison, who insisted that inventory was properly synced and visible on their end. No errors. No delays. Just confusion. By 8:05, influencers started posting. The comments were not what anyone had hoped for. 1. Popular wellness creator posted a screenshot of her empty cart with a caption implying fake scarcity. Another user filmed herself nearly crying after trying and failing to secure the cardigan she'd been waiting all year for. It was spiraling fast. Miles stood motionless for a moment, then walked out of the glass-walled office and onto the patio overlooking the olive trees. The Montecito air was still chilly, but the sun had begun to paint the sky pink. He breathed in deeply and held it longer than usual. Back inside, Felix was still typing, his voice low but urgent as he tried again to reach their platform contact. And still, Meghan had not checked in. She was somewhere in the house, likely with the creative director, editing a visual story about morning rituals. She had told the team she wanted to be in a state of calm during the relaunch and had asked not to be disturbed unless it was a spiritual emergency. Miles clenched his jaw. It wasn't a spiritual emergency. It was a brand emergency, which in their world was worse. By 8:17, the Threads feed had caught fire. The hashtag #AsNeverAgain was trending. Someone had looped a crying baby gif under the caption, "Can't even buy a towel from a duchess," and it had over 40,000 likes in under 10 minutes. Miles closed the dashboard. He walked back to his seat, sat down heavily, and stared at the monitor again. Then he took a deep breath, removed his smartwatch, and set it on the table as if admitting that time itself had betrayed him. And at that moment, He understood something he'd been too proud to consider before. This wasn't a backend glitch. This was a narrative failure. And in Meghan's carefully manicured world of linen, eucalyptus, and curated empathy, there might not be a second chance dot by late morning. The Montecito estate had become unusually silent. The kind of silence that doesn't soothe, it thickens. Felix John stood by the window in the north hall, staring at the gravel driveway without really seeing it. He had just come off a 23-minute call with their e-commerce integrator, and he still hadn't gotten a straight answer. He muttered to himself and refreshed his inbox, hoping someone from the Shopify team would magically explain what had gone wrong. But there was nothing. Just automated receipts, influencer refund requests, and a growing number of customer complaints marked urgent. Miles Reddington had left the operations room an hour earlier without saying where he was going. Felix assumed he had gone to the South Cottage, the one that functioned as a makeshift editing studio when Meghan needed creative space. But Miles had actually locked himself in the soundproof meditation suite behind the guest kitchen. He wasn't meditating. He wasn't speaking. He was simply sitting on the floor with his back against the padded wall, eyes open, trying to calculate whether this disaster would destroy the fragile rebranding they had worked on for 5 months. Meanwhile, on the other end of the estate, Meghan had decided to begin filming an apology vignette. Not a direct message, nothing as clumsy as that, just a quiet reel. A tea kettle boiling in slow motion, wind playing with sheer curtains. Her favorite ceramic mug gently steaming. She wanted it to suggest calm, care, intention. The problem was, no one was asking for aesthetics anymore. They were asking for accountability. At 11:42 a.m., Vibe House, one of the largest minimalist lifestyle blogs in North America, published a headline that would quickly dominate the conversation. As ever's Restock blunder, incompetence, or intent? The accompanying article was subtle but sharp, dissecting the discrepancy between the brand's poetic messaging and its logistical failures. The writer suggested that As Ever might be practicing manufactured scarcity to heighten emotional urgency and fake exclusivity. It wasn't framed as an accusation, it was framed as a question. But it hit harder than any direct attack. Felix forwarded the link to Miles, not knowing that Miles had already read it twice and had been watching the comment count tick up like a slow-burning fuse. By noon, Felix stared at it for a long time. Then he closed the app, and at that moment, both men understood the same thing without needing to say it aloud. This wasn't about product failure. This was about emotional credibility. And once you lose that, no fabric, no matter how soft, can patch it back together. Julian Merrick stepped out of the black SUV without waiting for a greeting. He wore a slate gray suit that hadn't wrinkled during the 5-hour flight from New York. His shoes made no sound as he walked across the stone driveway toward the main house. He didn't bother to text anyone about his arrival. When the brand you invest in starts hemorrhaging public trust, you don't wait for an invitation. Inside, Miles noticed the approaching silhouette through the east-facing window. He stood up instinctively, not out of formality, but survival. Felix had just returned from an exhausting session with the Shopify integration rep, another dead end. When he saw Julian enter without a word, he straightened up and began closing down non-essential browser tabs. He had worked with Julian once before, years ago, when a luxury shoe startup had collapsed overnight. That memory resurfaced like a warning. Julian walked straight into the conference room and removed his jacket with mechanical precision. Then he looked around the room, scanning the faces of Miles, Felix, the analytics manager, and 2 junior assistants who had no idea where to place their hands. He asked no pleasantries. He simply sat and pulled a folder from his briefcase. Inside were 5 pages of printed screenshots, comments, reposts, influencer takedowns, and resale forums mocking the failed launch. He began flipping through them. Slowly, as if slicing into each layer of rot with a scalpel, Miles tried to explain the inventory error, but Julian raised a hand to silence him. Then he turned to Felix and asked for a 30-second summary of what had happened and what hadn't. Felix hesitated, then admitted they had reused product shells from the previous site without fully remapping inventory URLs. Julian didn't flinch. He simply circled a line in the report with a fountain pen and slid the page back toward the center. Then he asked the question that reset the entire room. What did the brand mean to customers before this? Miles answered first. He said it meant softness, intimacy, care. He used words like refuge and quiet beauty. Julian nodded. Then he asked what it meant now. No one spoke. In the silence that followed, Julian clicked open his laptop and began projecting a spreadsheet onto the wall. It showed daily order drop-off, influencer reversals, and a new line, projected lifetime value loss based on brand sentiment erosion. It was brutal, clinical, and definitive. He pointed to a section labeled Customer Trust Decay. Then he looked up and told them what none of them wanted to hear. If this continued for even 3 more days, the brand would have to rebuild from scratch. No amount of apology content or influencer contracts would undo what had happened if the narrative wasn't shifted immediately. Meanwhile, in another wing of the house, Meghan was in a creative workshop session with her visual director. She was choosing between 3 different hues of linen for the new lookbook shoot. Her phone had been turned face down for hours. She hadn't seen the article from Vibe House. She hadn't heard about the meme storm or the influencer who publicly unfollowed the brand mid-live stream. Julian asked to see the internal Slack logs. He read the team's real-time reactions from the morning of the launch: panic, deflection, passive blame. Then he reached the messages from a junior consultant named Theo. He paused. Theo had quietly flagged a backend error in the product architecture 4 days before the restock went live. No one had followed up. Julian stood up and requested Theo's presence in the room. When Theo arrived, unsure of why he'd been summoned, Julian asked him to walk everyone through what he had noticed that week. Theo, nervous but composed, described how the old product IDs were never relinked to the updated backend. It was a small technical oversight, but it had triggered the entire collapse. Julian listened carefully, then thanked him and dismissed the rest of the room except for Miles and Felix. He turned to them and said that if the intern had more foresight than the leadership, they needed to rethink who was really managing the brand. Then he suggested something no one had dared to voice yet: freezing the next product launch, a temporary blackout. A pause, not just in sales, but in presence. Felix looked stunned. Miles looked defeated. And Julian? He buttoned his coat, prepared to fly back out by sundown. His job wasn't to soften the message. His job was to prevent total loss. And in that moment, as Theo walked back down the hallway with unsure footsteps, and Meghan sipped tea 2 rooms away, Miles finally accepted that the damage had outpaced the narrative. They weren't controlling the story anymore. The story was controlling them. 4 days had passed since the failed launch, and the silence had begun to feel oppressive. Not elegant, not minimal, just empty. The as-ever social accounts hadn't posted since the ceramic cup video, and even that had been quietly deleted 12 hours after it went up. No statement had followed, no apology, no explanation. Just a heavy, curated stillness. Miles Reddington sat alone in the garden studio with the sliding door slightly ajar. The air carried hints of rosemary and whetstone. He had opened his laptop 3 hours ago and hadn't typed a word. The blinking cursor mocked him. He had been tasked with writing the internal postmortem and executive summary titled "What We Learned." The irony of it twisted in his chest like a dull blade. What had they learned, really? That aesthetic wasn't a shield? That silence, when mistaken for sophistication, could become sabotage? Down the hill, Theo had moved into a corner of the logistics trailer. He was now unofficially leading the